Hello and welcome to another edition of Ready, Everything Real Estate, Divorce, and You. Today we have a special guest here, Greg Zub. I have personally known Greg Zub. He's from Northwestern Mutual. He's a financial planner. I personally know Greg since college, back in our days in college, and 30 years he's been practicing as a financial advisor now. Always remember, really impressed me, your diligence and how you stepped into that business. And here 30 years later, you have a huge, great book of business. And more importantly, a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge. So, to tell us a little bit about yourself, Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. As Ken mentioned, I'm at Northwestern Mutual, wealth management advisor. I've been there almost 30 years, have a team of 5. Really what we focus on is being strategic advisors with a specialty in retirement distribution strategies. But the challenges we're going to talk about here in a little bit is that, one of my favorite quotes, man makes plan and God laughs. So nobody gets married planning on divorce, but it happens. And so when it does, you've got to do what's in your heart, but you got to do it smart. And that's not always the easiest thing.
No, it gets clouded very easily.
Very much
The
so.
emotions and logic don't mesh very well at some points.
Yep, absolutely. And so a lot of times when people are going through that process, you've got the emotions there, you've got the finances there, and you got to do both. And so the biggest issue that I tend to come across, and if I've got 2 clients, right, they're getting divorced, is how we're going to split everything. And you want the kids to be in the same school district. But if you have a dual income family, that might not be a possibility. And people think of their primary residence as an investment. It's not from a standpoint of all the money you put into it and you've got carrying costs. Well, if you got 2 incomes, you can handle it. If you only got 1, it might be a little bit more of a challenge. So the desire, the emotional kick might be, hey, we want to keep the kids in the same school system. But that isn't always an option. And so you really have to think about when you're splitting your assets, what is a value added for long term, whether it's college, retirement, is there debt? And then what's a carrying cost? We have 1 house, 2 houses. Do we have how many cars? Whatever those other expenses are. Because if you buy it, and you put a ton of money into it, and you don't get to sell it for a profit, then it's not an asset, right? It's a liability.
Would you say that you work pretty closely with divorce attorneys to facilitate the process, or, does that ever come into play where, you try to integrate into that do they ever contact you? Do they consult with you, or are you kind of just standalone product with your clients?
Yeah. And it depends on the client, number one, but absolutely, because, you've got different types of investment accounts, obviously retirement accounts, you've got non-qualified accounts or taxable. So if we're trying to split stuff up, you're not going to give one party all the retirement accounts and all taxable accounts to the other. So especially with the non-taxable or with the taxable accounts, you're going to have a cost basis and an unrealized gain. So if you're going to split this up, there's going to be a tax consequence somewhere. So you've got to work with the attorneys in order to make sure that both sides understand the math. Because one party might look at it and say, well, we have this much money. How come I'm only getting this? Well, you got to pay tax on it. So you got to break it down.
Absolutely. It's harder to explain to some people than others. Some people get it right away. Others don't. But we always tell them, talk to your financial advisor, talk to your CPA. And then we come back. And even if we have somebody that's maybe a litigation support specialist or a business valuation expert in that particular case, or even a forensic accountant, and we have them also come in and break it down to where our clients can really see it and they're making an educated decision. Because it's easy for all of us as experts up here to throw around all these different terms to them and tell them, oh, don't worry about it, Quadro will take care of it and this and that. But what really is that and what does it do? And that's why they need to consult with professionals such as yourself, such as their CPA, and to get that advice. And sometimes what we come across is a lot of people, some of my clients will tell me, oh, listen, I don't want to work with my current financial advisor because my husband has a better relationship with him or her, or my wife does, and I want somebody new. And so then sometimes somebody such as yourself would, and correct if I'm wrong, would come up, kind of get caught up to speed, request, copy everything, and figure out a plan moving forward for them. And I feel like that's really important, because when clients ask me, hey, what do you think is smarter? Should I take more of this or more of that? Assuming we're offsetting something with something else and not actually dividing everything down the middle. And I tell them, listen, talk to a financial advisor, talk to one that whether your own or somebody you trust, or interview a few of them and figure out what makes the most sense for you. As you said regarding the house, if, obviously most people can't afford on, depends on how much extra liquid they are, how they've done saving. But usually on when you're separating a living, supporting two separate households, you can't do that on the same income or incomes you were doing before. But the question is too, if that's your priority, how are you going to make it happen? And is it something to where you can afford to be cash poor or not? And sometimes people get really emotional about the house one way or another, really insist on wanting it. And sometimes at the 11th hour, once they finally calm down and spoken to a professional, an expert financial advisor, they realize, hey, listen, this isn't the smartest thing. And at that point, either then the house gets sold and split or gets awarded to them and immediately listed for sale. So those are all things to think about.
I think moms really want their kids. Well, for me, when I got divorced, my biggest thing was how can I keep their life as safe and normal,
Constant,
as
yep.
constant. These are yeah. And so that's why I couldn't keep our house, but you want to be able to try to do that. So it's really good to have experts that come alongside financially and legally to say, listen, I get that. The heartstrings are being pulled. The kids, they don't know what's happening to them, but we have to look at what's best out. You want to be able to support your kids.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping them in that house and in that school, while that is, really great for their psyche, can you afford it? Because that's where it comes, where you need to come in, kind of like hold their hand and try to pull the emotions down a bit so that they can see the actual
and are
full
you
picture.
really going to be able to maintain it? Because
Right.
if you're going to make a switch or transition, this is probably the time to do it, as opposed to another year or two in, realize we got to disrupt everything in
Exactly.
our kids' lives because we can't afford to stay here anymore. So those are obviously all things to
And there's
think
another
about.
thing too, that in Ken's world is that if you've got a husband and wife and one's going to keep the house, well, you want to get the other party's name off the mortgage. So
Absolutely.
then you got to do a refinance.
Yeah.
And right now you're 2 points above where you were 2 years ago. So you've got an additional expense
Correct.
just to carry that debt.
That's a very good
problem.
point. It's a very good point.
And
Some people
millage rates
think
are
about.
changing as well.
What's that?
Millage rates
Absolutely,
are
yeah.
changing. So a lot of taxes are going up. And if you sell and purchase, there's also that communication and that detail of, okay, if I refinance and I have this a little bit higher of a mortgage, the taxes are the same. Or do I sell and when I buy a new house, those taxes
It
and the
resets,
new
yep.
millage rate is at higher. So you
Yep.
actually have to look at both, go, what is even the best of the two negatives? Am I going to struggle with the current house with a higher interest rate, or am I going to buy a new house with a higher interest rate and higher taxes, most likely because you just purchased it?
Yeah.
And we talked about that on our last podcast.
Oh,
Yeah,
think
be
it's
able to make everything kind of fair and equitable would be, I would assume, one of the bigger challenges, like you said, because it is true. If you're going to refinance at a higher rate, but you're still gonna pay that rate if you buy another house anyways. So but making that, how does that shake out? These are really important.
But also, you guys bring up something else to think about is when somebody's name is on a mortgage with their spouse or soon to be ex that's going to end up being awarded that property, how are they going to get financing for another property? So they've got to be off. And sometimes people make the mistake of leaving their client or agreeing to stay on a mortgage probably longer than they should. But the flip side, the other mistake I see being made, or I think bad decision, is setting an unrealistic timeline for somebody to refinance a house. A lot of people say 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever. But I think even if you're going to say 90 days or longer, and you guys know this business better than I do, but I was building grace periods in there. Hey, or I don't want to say always, but I try to, and I advocate for that, to where if you can't get financing within a certain period of time, but you could show good faith efforts that you've been trying, you get a grace period for another so long. That way the house isn't forced to be sold right away or awarded to the other
You
side.
really have to navigate the whole situation, because if you have the one spouse that wants to get a new house, it can be affected by that, because you have to have 12 payments where the one spouse has to make the payments before the other spouse can qualify. So really it's, I have a situation right now, she keeps on dragging her heels, and it's not really getting any better and any easier, but her ex-husband's now starting to get on her. June is coming up as a date.
Yeah.
So if you sit down at the beginning of the divorce before, I know it takes 6 months to go through. There's a lot of this stuff that you can navigate beforehand, and you could speak into the judgment of the divorce, how to plan things out, and to, make sure that everybody can do what they want to do. I mean, there's a lot of situations when you have an amicable divorce, or there's some level of communication that you can work things out. But
Yep.
But something that you guys said earlier is the quad. Well, go ahead.
Audra.
I just-
Oh, no, I was going to say with that organization, how does that play in your industry, Greg? I was going to circle back to you, but if you have another question.
No,
Well,
I
Just
wanted to
the,
run.
the one point, and going back to something we said a minute ago, is that if you get a husband wife, and I do as an advisor, and they wind up getting divorced, probably 3/4 of the time I maintain both as clients moving forward, and it's completely impartial. We don't discuss anything. Obviously, there's a major confidentiality aspect to my career, but it doesn't always happen that way, and I completely understand it. If he or she feels that they want to go work with somebody else, I encourage it because they have to work with somebody. They need somebody to be able to advise them on this stuff. And so when you talk about splitting assets, college accounts is a prime one. If you're using a 529, there's 3 parties do a 529. There's the owner, there's a successor owner, and then the beneficiary. So if the husband's the owner and they get divorced, you can't split a 529. There's only one owner. So it's got to be in one person's name.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but
So
go ahead.
what you do-
I'll tell you, yeah.
if you need to, you can do annual reporting
Yes.
with statements, or you can put it in the contract, because the divorce agreement is a contract, that this is going to be used for college. And then what I advise my clients to do is, if they still want to save for college post that divorce, they open up new 529s for each of them.
I didn't even
Usually
think about
it's
the
easy.
529.
Usually what we do is the parent that's managing it or name on it or whatever the designation is called has to provide statements to the other parent, like you said, either annually or biannually, or in some cases where they really don't trust each other, they want monthly statements, which ends up creating a lot of extra time and money. But
Yep.
yeah, no, you're right about that. And usually those are awarded ultimately to the child and neither parent, unless there's some sort of agreement otherwise. But
Yeah, and it's like like if you have a doctor, and she's a surgeon and he stays at home. Well, all the investment accounts are going to be in his name because he has the less liability or less probability of liability, right, with a lawsuit than a surgeon does. So everything's going to be on that side of the equation. You can always switch ownership. You can transfer ownership, and it's not that big of a deal. But you can only have one owner. You can't split the accounts, right? So
It didn't even dawn on me for college.
Does that
Well-
get sticky sometimes then in those situations? Or
yeah, I mean, there's emotions on it. I mean, I get sometimes there's one case in particular where I was caught in the middle with an attorney that just didn't know what they were doing, because they kept, you have to split this account. Well, you can't. It's like an IRA. You can't just split an IRA and have 2 people on it. Now, to your point about the QDRO, QDRO stands for Qualified Domestic Relations Order.
Okay.
And so, for yourself, Ken, if you had a 401k and you want to take money out right now, you'd have to pay taxes on the gain plus a penalty because you're under age 59 and a half. But let's just say you have $500,000 in a 401k and you split it 50-50 at divorce. Well, then the QDRO that the judge signs will allow you to take $250,000 of it and roll it over to your soon-to-be ex-wife's IRA.
QDROs are signed at the end, though, right?
Well,
Or the divorce file or
it
before?
varies. And so,
yeah, I mean, sometimes there's certain exceptions to where it could be done earlier, but usually what happens is, however that account is awarded through the settlement agreement and the judgment of divorce is entered, once that happens, then usually our clients will hire a QDRO expert, but usually that's agreed upon by the 2 attorneys or the 2 sides ahead of time. Hey, here's who they're going to hire as a neutral attorney that's going to draft the qualified domestic relations order for them. And they would include in the judgment of divorce how it's going to be paid. Are they splitting it 50-50? Are you paying it all? Is she paying it all? Whatever. And then what happens is that's drafted. It's sent to both sides and their attorneys to review it and approve it. And then it gets submitted to the court by one of the sides. Court ends up approving it. Then it gets submitted for then the accounts to be divided. So it does take some time. I know people get impatient a lot of times, but it does take time.
But it's typically done before the divorce is fine.
No, that would be after typically.
so the
Now, if
QDRO
somebody
signed.
needs to borrow money, and I don't know exactly the tax consequences on that, and that's usually I refer them to their financial advisor or accountant to advise them on that. But there are sometimes some ways, and I don't know the specifics of it, but to be able to get out money while the divorce is going, or if they need to pay their lawyers and pay for legal fees or pay for starting new housing, as long as there's a mutual agreement or a court order.
yeah. And so there's 2 big things to think about with this, though, that are really important. So number one is there's always a valuation date. It can be an agreed upon date. It can be the date the judge signs it, the divorce finalized. But let's just pretend for a minute the valuation date is April 1. All right. So the wife, in this case, has the ability to go get her half, but she's got to submit the quid pro. So
Half as of the April 1st
as of
valuation
the date,
date.
yeah, whatever that
So
value
if it's
is.
Black Monday after valuation date, you're SOL.
That's awesome. That's awesome because you want the market to be down.
Okay.
And so this is we were talking about this earlier, real life example. I have a client who she became a client after about a year and a half. She was divorced,
Okay.
never went and got the money. Well, that she got divorced in February of 20. So the market dropped, right? It was the end of 20 or end of
Okay.
February, excuse me. And she didn't go get her share. So it sat in that account for another year and a half. And her husband, ex-husband, made about $250,000. That could have been her money had she transferred it because there's a value as of that date.
Okay.
Not a number of shares, of value. So if it's worth 500,000 and she gets 250 and he kept it for another year and a half when 20 and 21 was like that,
Mhm.
all that gain is his to keep.
Wow.
On the reverse, if you're the person that's splitting your account, I tell every single client of mine, whatever that dollar amount is on that date, let me move it to the money market. So there's no volatility. Because if you have that 500,000 on the valuation date and the market drops 20% and now it's worth 400, you still owe your ex 250.
You just move it under like an IRA umbrella,
So then,
right?
yep. So then you're only keeping 150 when it should have been
Okay.
250. If you would have moved that portion to cash inside the IRA, waiting for the document to come through,
Mhm.
then you'd be okay. And the issue we ran into with COVID was that judges weren't quick on getting the quid pro signed.
Okay.
So it wasn't as much her fault or her attorney's fault as it was just the timing of
The
everything.
timing.
No, that happens
Now-
a lot, and sometimes they take a while, even in allowing or granting permission for you to be able to transfer that money, because it could be something to where you settled in a settlement agreement, but then there's post judgment or post settlement arbitration issues. Maybe somebody misrepresented the amount of their incentive that they received, or maybe that accounts weren't necessarily accurate, or maybe something happened, or maybe they're still fighting over something, and so they're not permitted yet either by the judge or arbitrator to actually make that transfer sometimes. So,
Yep.
and that causes a lot of anxiety for
So the valuation date is the valuation date. Is that date's picked before the judge typically signs off on it, you said?
Well, unless the judge rules on it and orders
Okay.
it, but if there's mutual agreement, so usually, I mean, it could be anything. It could be data, say people have been separated or separate when they file. It could be data filing if that's what they agree. Usually, if a judge rules on it, it's based on that day that the judge rules. If we're going to mediation and we settle, most of the time we pick that date as the date, or we might say today's February, whatever, and we pick a date that say we're going to pick March 1st as the date, and that's the date. That's it. And then maybe status quo would be maintained until that day.
Okay.
So say you and your spouse are still living together, but your plan is in a couple weeks you're going to be moving out, or she's going to be moving out. What happens is you're still both going to pay the bills mutually, or however you guys have been paying them. But starting on that trigger date, whatever that date is, that's the date you agree things are going to be split. But there's multiple ways to do it. That's just one of many examples.
Yeah. Interesting.
And when typically, the average American has 7 different jobs in their life.
Mhm.
And so the worst thing you can do is leave a 401k at every other employer, right? You want to combine them all and move them with you as you move into an IRA, because you're going to own the same thing pretty much across all these different 401ks, and you're just paying more expenses.
Mhm.
And no one's really watching it, right? But the problem is that if you have assets before you get married, an IRA, let's say, and then you get married and you've got a 401k, and then you leave that employer and you roll in an ISA, how do you know in the future what was premarital and what was postmarital and what was the growth of it, right?
Yeah.
And so they got to be a good client, because it's a lot of work, but
Good.
I've had to do it and figure it out.
Yeah.
And, it's got to be fair, right?
Mhm.
And so I show all my math and I give it to the 2 attorneys and let them figure it out. But, you got to be smart about how you split that up, which leads me to the next point, different types of accounts. And this is crucial. If you have a 401k and say you've got 250,000 in it, and you leave your employer, you can move that to an IRA. But if you win the lottery and you have $2 million in cash, you can't put $250,000 in an IRA, right? There's a limit on what you do per year, 401k and an IRA. A 401k is pre-tax dollars, tax-deferred growth, and you pay tax on the distribution. The most efficient way to accumulate money, but the least efficient asset to use at retirement. Then you've got your regular investment accounts, non-qualified, E-Trade. Your bank account's really a non-qualified account. After tax money, you pay tax on the gain, and then whatever's unrealized gain at the end, you pay tax on again. And then your third is a Roth IRA. After tax money, compounds tax deferred, but it's tax free in the back end. So if you're splitting up assets, you have to take into consideration the tax consequences on all of them. So if the husband says to the wife, I'm going to give you all the non-qualified accounts, I'm going to keep all the IRAs, that's brutal for her because she's losing all that tax deferred growth between then and retirement. Or if she wants to take all the Roths, that doesn't make sense either.
Most
so when you're
attorneys
looking,
recognize
well,
that.
but most attorneys don't do that though.
Okay.
Some might not, you know? So you really have to look at, I mean, you got to look out for yourself,
Yeah.
right?
And it's better to have them consult with somebody like
Yeah.
Greg to give them that advice that we necessarily can't give or shouldn't or won't give, and depending on the circumstances. But usually the best thing is consult with your financial expert to be able to figure out what the smartest thing to do. And then as lawyers, we get direction then from our client or the expert involved, obviously with the client's blessing, and then that's what we negotiate for, advocate for if the case were to go to a hearing.
But if somebody had like 500,000 in a 401k and they're splitting it up, doesn't the quidro allow them to put it in another tax deferred vehicle? Where there's not
Absolutely. That's the benefit of
Okay.
quidros. You can move it without a
Okay.
tax consequence.
Okay.
But as we're like, let's just say that he's got 500 and they've got a non-qualified account. Maybe she doesn't want 250 from that because she's going to go buy a house because he's going to keep the house. That might make sense.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
he keeps 350 and she only gets 150 of the IRA, but she gets more over here. That's the kind of math you have to look at.
100%.
The tax consequence too, where I don't know if you put $100,000 in this investment over 20 years and now it's worth 300. Is it really worth 300? No, it's not, because it's 200,000 you got to pay taxes on when you go to use those dollars. So it's really only worth 240 or whatever the math is, right?
Gotcha.
So, you know, it's funny to Jeff's comment. I'm not an attorney and I'm not a CPA, but I know enough to be dangerous and how it intersects with me. And when it gets to the point where you got to make a decision, you have to go pay somebody to give you the advice on that because I can't give you that advice.
It's something that you said, like I said, I was speaking to it again. It was always impressed me, like coming to visit your office and just seeing how dedicated you were. This guy all the way back into college was
Absolutely.
always building his book of business and going and learning. And so
It's
all
like,
comes-
so my mom was a teacher. My sister is a teacher. I would love to be a teacher. I'm just too materialistic, right? So I'm helping people in a different way. I'm teaching people in a different
still
way. And I
teaching.
love it. Yes,
still
absolutely. I
But in
am.
a way,
And
by
just-
doing that and by out there hustling and, as Ken said, building your book of business, that only benefits your clients and your future clients because that's how much more experience you have in knowledge and the ability and power to be able to continue to learn more. And through all the networking and through building your business, it just allows for more opportunities to learn more and to have more experience to help your clients out. So,
Yep.
And really quickly, I know we're wrapping up in a minute, but what would you say your ideal client is, or how can people best find you? Where is your expertise? Clearly you know a lot.
that's like
Yeah.
3 questions,
Well,
Holly.
and let me
You
get
can
this.
You can pick and choose how you want to answer. I'm giving you some ideas, but
So-
what would be your?
Well, let me sum one quick thing up real quick. And that is that the one thing that we haven't talked about, we talked about the offensive side of the equation, the investments, right? The tough side is the defensive side when you deal with the insurances, the life, the disability, the long-term care. Nobody plans on that happening. And was it 2019? I lost 7 friends that were plus or minus 2 years in age. 5 are cancer and 2 are accidents.
Ugh.
So the impact in someone's life is when you show up somewhere and you've got a check. Or you can say to the widow, which I was able to do, you're your husband, take care of your family, I've got everything else covered. That's where you get that pat on the back. Now, if you had a machine in your attic that was just spitting money out nonstop, how much would you insure that thing for? A lot, right? And we don't think about disability insurance, but that's where that piece of the equation is. If you get divorced and you're getting paid alimony or child support, that other human is that machine. So you need to have some level of life insurance on them. You can go in the court order. It doesn't have to be a huge amount.
And sometimes
Depending on what
people
the amount
buy it
is.
out on the other, or on their own policy, they would list the other parent as a beneficiary for a certain amount, and it could be a declining amount annually or whatever to be able to secure that, assuming there's no other security. But usually that's the most cost effective and best way to secure.
Yeah, you just do it. It's a 20-year term
secure.
policy. Done. It's simple. But if something happens to the other party, you're in trouble
Mhm.
because they're dead. You can't collect,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
So I wanted to bring that up real quick before I answered your question
That's a
there.
great point. I mean, people don't
I
think
feel
of
like that should be. So we just talked about
huge.
offense, and now we should talk about defense. We should have a whole nother podcast on defense.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot that people don't think about just because you're so busy with life and you're busy raising kids and a family and you're working and you're trying to, do what you have to do. So all these things, again, having the right professionals in your life to lead you, to guide you. So probably call you sooner than later, I would assume, to set things up properly, to get your life together. And then when events like divorce come,
Mm-hmm.
you're more strategically involved to help with that than somebody who maybe hasn't set anything up and they're running to you like with their hair on fire.
Absolutely. And so, I define my younger clients as being under the age of 55.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I meet somebody when they're 60 or 65, I really can't impact them. I can only change maybe directions of what they've already done. When I meet people when they're younger, under 55, I can still impact their lives.
I like that that's younger,
So,
by the way, under 55.
absolutely.
Makes me
And
feel
so-
good over here.
You might be
So about
25.
time.
Still young.
Well, you might be 25, but we're still talking about retirement. Or
Mhm.
35, because getting married, having children, buying that house, funding colleges, and the whole scheme of life, that's easy.
Mhm.
When you walk out that office for the last time, you shut off that light switch and you close that door behind you, that's when life gets hard. Because you are not allowed a financial mistake because it's irrevocable. You can never recover from that. This bucket of money you worked your whole life to build is all you got. There's no more paychecks coming in. So when you talk about an ideal client, I have a whole team. And, I'm not at 55. I'm getting a lot closer to it, but I've got 2 generations below me in decades. So those 25 and 35-year-olds fit with members on my team. And, we want people that have a high moral caliber, a sense of responsibility to their family.
Mhm.
If they only care about themselves, that's not somebody we want to work with.
Mhm.
We want people that have a great trajectory in life and that care about doing good for others. It's really that simple.
Sounds good to me.
Greg, how did people find you?
I think we're going to put a link on the website after the podcast today.
Okay, cool.
But GregZub.com is a simple way, or through Northwestern Mutual in Troy.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining
Thanks,
us
Greg.
today.
Appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you for everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.